I'm Julia Seidman, and I'm going to be talking today about docs, equity, and imposter syndrome, although not actually in that order. So briefly, a little bit about me. I've had what I sometimes call a careen rather than a career. I had every intention of going into museum studies as a new college graduate, but wound up in financial communications. I worked there for several years, then got a master's in teaching and taught high school English and ESL for the better part of a decade. From there, I took some time off and found my way to a coding boot camp, which I finished about a year and a half ago. And since then, I've been working as a technical content writer and developer on a freelance basis. So as a new developer, I heard a lot about imposter syndrome, which I'm sure you have too, from friends, from teachers, from bloggers. And it never quite added up to me. It is a real psychological phenomenon. There's lots of literature about it, but it is a phenomenon that is associated with people further down the road in their careers. It's something where someone with significant achievements essentially doubts their ability to reproduce those results. It's what imposter syndrome is not, is the kind of generalized anxiety, deep self-doubt, feelings of isolation and exclusion that so many career changers, early career developers experience. Those feelings are common, extremely valid, but not imposter syndrome. And one of the things that I think is important to remember is that they're feelings that are often experienced more by people who have experienced bias and discrimination in the workplace. The tech industry is not doing well in terms of diversity. It's a goal all over the place. There's no company out there that doesn't make some claim to be pursuing diversity and equity. But marginalized groups in the industry are still facing some pretty serious barriers. As you can see here, women are badly underrepresented, particularly at the executive level. Representation of racial diversity is even worse. And for the intersection, women of color, they are catastrophically underrepresented. And truthfully, we're just not making very much progress. So earlier this year, I read a piece from the Harvard Business Review called "Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome." And it got me thinking about the dynamics of what we call imposter syndrome. I picked out this comic because it was intended to illustrate what imposter syndrome is, this thing that everyone theoretically experiences. But when I look at this comic, I see a scenario that is actually quite uncommon: a female boss and a male underling. And to me, to use this as an illustration of this supposedly universal phenomenon of imposter syndrome feels disingenuous. When we know that women and people of color report these kinds of anxieties at much greater rates than men, and that those anxieties probably go quite a ways towards explaining that attrition that we saw at the higher levels of management. So if we're going to talk about something that affects, quote, everyone in the industry, talking about it in this gender-blind, color-blind way doesn't add up for me. Part of the reason it doesn't add up is that while imposter syndrome is real, it's not the whole story. It doesn't account for the impacts of discrimination and bias. When we talk about experiences of discrimination and bias in terms of imposter syndrome, we locate the responsibility for that problem with the individual, when really it is a systemic problem and the responsibility lies with the community and the system. And so that's kind of what where I am starting with what I'm talking about today. We can do better. We all have a responsibility to try to change this industry for the better. We're here, I assume, because we want to improve people's lives in some way. It can be hard, though, to know what you as an individual can do. My light bulb moment was when I realized that I could apply some of the principles that I used every day as a teacher and curriculum developer, and I could apply those principles to tech writing. And that by doing that, by creating docs that were more thoughtful, more equitable, I could maybe make a meaningful contribution to the community. So this started for me in part with an experience that I had when I first started kind of getting into the tech industry. I originally had planned to go into a data science boot camp, and I was doing some prep work recommended by the instructors from that program. And one of the things that they recommended was they pointed me to a book and they said, this is the best way to learn Python. The author of this book, which I'm not going to name, is a very well-known writer. He has a well-trafficked website. He has a whole series of books. And I thought, okay, I got the book. I started reading, and I was blown away by blatant homophobia, transphobia, and misogyny throughout the book. As a woman and as a member of the queer community, it made me feel awful. What's worse is that when I actually looked into it later on, I found out that the author was actually fairly well known for what Wikipedia called his polemical views, and has actually gone on the record defending his right to be a homophobe. His first real public calling out was in 2008, which was a full decade before this book was recommended to me. When I realized that, I immediately thought, well, this motto of inclusivity and equity that this data science bootcamp is promoting is completely hollow. It was enough. I knew this could not be the best way to learn. I knew there had to be better options. And ultimately, I did find them. But it was actually enough to turn me off from data science completely. So the kind of bias that I saw and the prejudice and just awfulness that I saw in that book is just sort of one relatively extreme example of what I think is holding us back when it comes to docs. Your goal when you write blog posts, tutorials, whatever, I hope, is to make your content accessible to as many people as possible. At the same time, many of us have had experiences with docs that make us feel hopelessly left out and incompetent. But you know what? You've made it this far. You're not incompetent. You're smart, and you can do hard things. The problem is that a lot of the common tropes of tech writing get in the way of being able to really understand what the next step forward is. So, I thought from my kind of toolkit as a teacher that one of the kind of most meaningful places to start would be to look at what's called culturally responsive teaching principles. So if we want to educate diverse users and grow our audience and user base and reach more diverse groups, starting with this approach makes sense. Normally it means tailoring to a specific classroom or school community, but many of the principles are just good teaching. And the main driving idea is that we need to step outside ourselves and think about community more broadly. So the principles of CRT: reflect on your own cultural lens, recognize and redress bias in the system, communicate in linguistically and culturally responsive ways, demonstrate respect for diversity, and emphasize real-world context. I think that this first one is the most important. Being aware of your own biases is absolutely essential in addressing them and making up for those deficits in your own worldview. Before you begin writing anything, you need to inventory your own assumptions, figure out what it is that you are missing from your point of view, and reach out to fill in those gaps. Think, challenge your own biases. The next step is to really intentionally set out to address the problems of bias and inequity in the industry. Equity means leveling a playing field, giving everyone a chance to feel fully included. You need to start with the intention to help those who are feeling excluded. Sometimes I think that this can come across as an invitation to patronize. It's not. When we look at women in tech, when we look at communities of color, when we look at other marginalized groups, what is holding people back is not a lack of intellect or drive. Those things are there in abundance. What is missing are resources, prior knowledge, a feeling of safety, a feeling of inclusion. So when you write for people's best selves, when you bring your best self to your writing, everyone will benefit. The next principle is the practical one. Basically, I see this one as talk to people where they are. I think that there is a problem with a lot of writers essentially approaching their writing as a way to prove their own in-group status. Maybe that's not conscious, but I think it happens. And that, it just doesn't actually benefit anyone. People who are in the in-group are not going to be impressed, and people who are not in the in-group are going to have a much harder time learning from you. So meet people where they are. Use plain language, explain yourself, spell it out, provide live links, give people the tools they need to learn more and to really understand what it is that you're talking about. Use well-known cultural references, relatable metaphors, concrete examples, variable names that mean something, and acknowledge that this stuff is challenging. People need stepping stones. They don't need their hand held, but they need stepping stones. Emphasize real-world context. To me, this means create space for people to be their whole selves. I try really hard to do this when I'm writing use case pieces in particular. There's no reason that every tutorial, every use case needs to be based on the same tired, unrelatable scenarios. Come up with something from your real life, from your community writ large. There are all kinds of people and all kinds of organizations that can benefit from technology. So come up with examples, contexts that feel fresh and relatable. Finally, this should be simple, but there are so many forces telling us it doesn't matter. Demonstrate respect. There's no reason that docs should be a place to make people uncomfortable, to revel in your own ability to be a pariah. It matters to demonstrate respect for people. So the bad news is bias is endemic in tech. Many people feel excluded and marginalized. And there are a lot of reasons for this. I'm certainly not suggesting docs are the only cause. But I think they're a powerful force, especially for self-taught developers and career changers. So just to kind of wrap it all up, I want to bring it back to that idea of imposter syndrome and workplace anxiety. Those feelings of anxiety and exclusion are real, no matter where they come from, and they are harmful. You have the power to help other people feel their challenges are accepted and normal. And along the way, as you help others, you will find your own power. Thanks so much for listening.